Hi, I'm Phil Harbottle and this is my 72nd video in which I'm discussing detective fiction written by SF writer John Russell Fearn. Fearn's first hardcover detective novel is by Hugo Blaine, was Except for One Thing, published in 1947 by Stanley Paul. It featured Chief Inspector Garth, who was also the lead character in the next novel, The Five Matchboxes, 1948. Here's a summation of the plots. Except for one thing. Many criminals have often believed they'd committed the perfect crime and have blundered. Chief Inspector Garth of Scotland Yard believed that in these days of modern science, a perfect crime has even less chance of being committed. He gives his friend Richard Harvey a resume of the mistakes made by past criminals. But as a pathologist and scientist, Harvey believes that he can so completely rid himself of an unwanted fiancée that none will ever be able to tell what became of the corpse. Yet though he lays a master plan and uses modern scientific methods to bring it to fruition, he makes not one but several mistakes. This book is a classic of inverted crime and has been widely acknowledged as the precursor of Columbo. A bestseller in its day, copies can still be found online. The Five Matchboxes warned of the impending murder of Granville Collins, stockbroker. Chief Inspector Garth of Scotland Yard suspects a hoax, but keeps the potential victim under observation. The dyspeptic Garth becomes more dyspeptic than ever when Collins is found shot dead in his office, the windows closed and the door locked, with the building watched from every convenient angle by the police. Nobody except Collins was seen to enter the building. Nobody left it. An impossible crime with no clue except 5 empty matchboxes on the desk of the dead man's office. From this curious bit of evidence and sidelights on the dead man's astonishing character, Garth proceeds to knot together the threads which take him back not only to the cause of the murder, but to a crime labelled by the Yard as case uncompleted. This is a very rare edition, almost impossible to find today in dustjacket. Fearn then created Dr. Hiram Carruthers in his third novel, Flashpoint, sold in 1947 but not published until 1950. Carruthers was an egotistical scientist who assists the police to solve seemingly impossible crimes. Returning to his hometown after an interval of many years, Gordon Drew finds himself secretary to a Dr. Carruthers, an eccentric physicist who egotistically labels himself as the Admirable Crichton of scientific specialists. In this capacity, he helps the local police solve a baffling series of fires, whilst the staid Superintendent Denon sets to work in methodical fashion to trace not only the arsonist, but also a murderer. The gripping story moves among little people, a fishmonger and a florist, as well as the big people of the town in the shape of a powerful, ambitious emporium owner and a borough surveyor. Here there's crime and murder aimed at an astonishing objective, fascinating, authentic, with science as the main weapon by which the evildoer achieves his effects. In this field, however, the remarkable Dr. Carruthers also excels, and it is his analyses, as much as Superintendent Denon's plot and perseverance, which finally brings the solution to the problem and justice to the criminal. The character of Dr. Carruthers was brilliantly realised, not surprising because the book was the one thing Fearn had been working on for several years. Carruthers was the very same tea-drinking detective character that Fearn had first conceived back in 1937, but who had been first developed as Brutus Lloyd in 1940, as I showed in my previous video. The proof of this fact can be seen in the following quotes. This quote is from The Man Who Saw Two Worlds, and it's included in this posthumous collection of the Brutus Lloyd stories. Lloyd was no more than 4 feet 10 inches tall, an amazing gnome-like man. He was not a dwarf or a freak, simply vest pocket size. The most surprising thing about him was his head. It was squarish with a brow like a baby cliff, capped on top by a tuft of jet black hair, which permitted one lock to curl down in a J down the immense forehead. Now this next quote is from Flashpoint 1950. The figure under the portico came out to meet him in the dying light. All Gordon could observe was the man's extraordinary smallness. He could not have been more than 4 feet 10, and sprouting a mane of grey hair which stood out Einstein fashion all round his massive head. In the clear electric light, the features were visible, and pretty remarkable they were too. There was, of course, that massive head and brow, then came a curved nose and a jutting lips and jaw. So Brutus Lloyd was obviously the progenitor of Dr. Carruthers. Now the final Blaine novel for Stanley Paul, What Happened to Hammond, had been sold in 1948, but paper shortages delayed its publication until 1951. In this novel, Fearn had the brainwave of teaming Dr. Carruthers with his other established character, Chief Inspector Garth. Now this novel shows even more of the influence of the Brutus Lloyd stories, in that it blurs into science fiction. In this original Stanley Paul hardcover edition, it's one of Fearn's rarest titles, almost impossible to find today. What Happened to Hammond is in the best traditions of John Dickson Carr, an author Fearn read and admired, and posits 2 impossible occurrences. The disappearance of a man from a house he's seen to enter, a house that's found to be empty and contains an undisturbed covering of dust, and the almost immediate reappearance of his corpse many miles away. Fearn's own dust wrapper blurb was intriguing. Doer Inspector Garth was bewildered. How on earth could a dead body travel 50 miles through a mist-wreathed winter night in the time it takes to smoke a cigarette? The inspector could deal effectively enough with solid, 3-dimensional problems, but the riddle of Hammond's inexplicable flight through the darkness was beyond him. Reluctantly, Garth called in the egotistical Dr. Carruthers, self-styled Admiral Crichton of Science, to see if the eminent physicist could throw some light on the mystery. The doctor could, but only after several wordy battles with the materialist inspector, who positively did not believe in fairies at the bottom of the garden. Unknown to himself, Carruthers was waging a war against time, for out in the London crowds was a lovely but harassed young girl, totally unconscious of the peril that awaited her in a certain dark, brooding house of strange secrets. This is not a story of magic, but of a subtly clever criminal who uses the latest scientific devices to brilliant effect, until the redoubtable Carruthers demonstrated, by means of a strangely airborne teapot, exactly what happened to Hammond. Unfortunately, in the autumn of 1950, Fearn had signed a contract with Sky Unlimited to write science fiction exclusively, which meant he could no longer write detective fiction. This was a great loss to the genre. What might Fearn, then at the peak of his powers, have gone on to achieve as a detective writer? Even so, incredibly, the John Slate and Hugo Blaine novels were still only a part of Fearn's extensive body of detective fiction. After the war, greatly encouraged by the success of his detective novels in England, Fearn had embarked on a serious attempt to crack the Canadian Toronto Star Weekly, a lucrative, high-paying market for all types of fiction. He was already selling the Star his golden Amazon SF novels, having realised that stories featuring a strong female character stood a good chance of acceptance from their lady editor, Gwen Cowley, with the majority of the Star Weekly's readership being women. In the late 1940s, he succeeded in selling to the Star a string of ingenious detective novels under his own name and the pseudonyms of Thornton Ayre and Frank Russell. But we'll look at these in my next video. These novels were fated not to be discovered and published in book form until after Fearn's death, but with just one exception. For a few months, at the end of 1952 and the beginning of 1953, Fearn was temporarily free of his Skyen contract. When Skyen had been hit by heavy fines for gangster obscenity, causing them to default on his payments. Before his debts were settled and the contract resumed, Fearn was able to resell one of his Star Weekly detective novels to Brown Watson Limited. Here it is, Shattering Glass, as by Frank Russell. At the time, no one knew this superb book was by Fearn, and it's now incredibly rare and impossible to find. We'll take a closer look at the plot of this and the other Star novels in my next video. In 1953, after his debts were settled, Fearn renegotiated his contract with Skyen to allow him to write non-science fiction for other publishers. He secured a commission to write 2 crime novels for Modern Fiction Limited. Fearn turned in an American gangster thriller, Don't Touch Me, published under the Spike Gordon house name. And that plot read, a perfectly planned jewel heist begins to go wrong when Gloria Fearn, a beautiful film starlet, is abducted by the escaping robbers. When gang leader Ace Monaghan begins to fall for Gloria, it leads to dissension amongst his men and the destruction and abandonment of his hideout. With Ace still holding the stolen jewels, being forced to go on the run alone, Gloria is free of his unwelcome attentions, only to fall into the hands of rival gangster Fingers Baxter, who plans to use her as a cat's paw to lure Ace out of hiding. Moving at a swift, relentless pace, this is a story of how human greed and corruption gradually encompasses the doom of the criminals involved. Fearn's other novel, Liquid Death, published under the Griff house name, whilst ostensibly a British gangster thriller, was also science fiction, where it dealt with the transmutation of lead into gold to make fake sovereigns. A gang of criminals are making English gold sovereigns to order, establishing a far-reaching racket in counterfeit coins and involving many innocent people in their toils. This in itself is enough to keep CID busy, but when there also appears a mysterious epidemic of deaths from snake bites, it's time for the experts to step in. Chief Inspector Dawson of the Metropolitan Division's scientific branch takes a hand, tracing the relationship between deadly snakebite and counterfeit coins. Aided by Detective Sergeant Harraday and the beautiful Gwenda Blaine, Dawson and his colleagues risk their lives to try and smash one of the most ruthless homicidal rackets of modern times. Both these entertaining books are now very rare collector's items. But even scarcer is this single intriguing murder mystery romance Fearn sold to Brown Watson in 1954, The Lonely Road Murder, published as by Elton Westwood, one of their confounded house names. Rosemary Lennox was horrified to find her best friend and neighbour, Mary Frances, strangled in her flat. Police suspicion fell initially on Mary's husband, but soon afterwards John Francis is also found murdered in the couple's flat. The police questioned Rosemary and her friend and fellow lodger Bob MacDonald, as well as the landlady Ellen Morland, but are unable to establish any motive. Bob and Rosemary attempt to investigate for themselves by visiting the nightclub where Mary and John Francis had worked, and whose owner, Les Roberts, had admitted to being in love with Mary. But at the club, Rosemary discovers evidence that points instead to her friend Bob. Now, as I've mentioned in earlier videos, in 1954, Sky Unlimited went through another upheaval, suffering a second and heavier fine for having published a gangster novel that had been adjudged obscene in the courts. This fine proved terminal. Sky had owed a great deal of money to the printer of the various paperback lines, the Dragon Press. To settle their debts, they transferred their assets to the Dragon Press, who now became the publishers of Sky Un's various established authors in the fields of science fiction, gangster and detective, western and romantic fiction. Fearn's contract still had 18 months to run, and as Sky Un's biggest asset, formed part of their settlement with the Dragon Press. The new publishers approached Fearn, and the outcome of their negotiations was that Fearn agreed to continue to write 2 novels a month for the new imprint, Dragon Books. But this time the type of novels was to be determined by the publisher on a month-to-month basis. It could be science fiction, it could be western, it could be romance. Such was his astonishing versatility that Fearn agreed to write in all 4 genres. Now, Fearn had already begun to introduce mystery and detective elements into his science fiction for Sky. There we see some examples of the science fiction detective work, such as the Adam Quirk series. But these are not the subject of the present video. Now that he was free to write all-out detective novels for his new publisher, Fearn decided to bring back Dr. Carruthers and Chief Inspector Garth, albeit now in the short novel length used by the Mushroom publishers. His first new Garth and Carruthers novel was Vision Sinister, published in November 1954. It carried his informative introductory blurb. Could 2 young women in full possession of their faculties look through a slide in the door and see a girl being murdered, and yet find the room beyond completely empty when they came to enter it with the police? This is the basis of Nat Carter's astonishing excursion into the webwork mysteries of up-to-the-minute science. This is not a science fiction story of the normal vintage, but a new departure altogether. The introduction of a famous backroom physicist and investigator, Dr. Carruthers. Many years ago, Carruthers had appeared with considerable success, and this is the time of his resurrection. In company with the dyspeptic Chief Inspector Garth of Scotland Yard, he sets out on a tortuous trail, and though the mystery of the killer's identity is not for long in doubt, the method used is a puzzle right to the end, until the cynical master scientist Carruthers fits the pieces into place. This is an excursion into the realms of positive fact, the utilization of present-day science to the bewilderment of the onlooker, as well as a grim prophecy of the lengths to which a determined criminal might go if well versed in the endless powers of science. We feel that not since Fearn of San Francisco, the scientific detective created by the late Dr. David Keller some 20 years ago, has there been a character so outstanding or so scientific as Dr. Carruthers. And this is only the beginning. In the webwork of scientific possibility and scientific detection, there are endless strands and puzzles. Now, astute readers might have done a double take at a reference to the author of this novel being Nat Carter rather than Hugo Blaine. Almost certainly Fearn himself would not have been expecting this and wouldn't have been pleased by it. The publisher had evidently decided that put it out under the Carter House name, because this had been Skyon's established best-selling gangster detective name, which Dragon planned to continue. And to rub salt in Fearn's wounds, a mistake at the production stage, as you can see there at the top, ran a headline from a totally different Nat Carter novel. Phil Casey, crime reporter, plays it tough, nothing to do with the story. So when Fearn's follow-up Gorillas and Garth novel for Dragon Books, when his follow-up novel appeared, the Hugo Blaine byline was restored at Fearn's insistence. The Silvered Cage was another ingenious story with even more fantastic and possible crime elements, the main two being the disappearance of a young woman from within the Silvered Cage, as you see in the illustration, and subsequent locked-room murder of the professional magician who had performed the trick. Once again, Fearn's introductory blurb was informative. For an illusionist, to make a woman vanish from a cage is merely stock and trade, because the woman must go somewhere. But in this instance, the woman concerned really disappears with a vengeance, in full view of an audience. This seemingly impossible happening is the commencement of a baffling disappearance puzzle, which even Scotland Yard finds a hard nut to crack. By degrees, it's seen that there's much more to the woman's disappearance than a mere magical feat. There are complicated issues behind it. Bogged down in the mists of stage magic, Commoner Garden Scotland Yard enlists the aid of a specialist at scientific jigsaws, and it is he who finally solves what has happened to the woman and explains away the brilliant ingenuity of the vanishing act. A thriller with a difference in that you watch a magical show and become involved in a baffling mystery at one and the same time. It's to be regretted that Fearn didn't write any more Hugo Blaine detective novels for Dragon Books during the remainder of his contract with them. Instead, he was commissioned to write numerous romances and westerns, as well as editing a monthly science fiction magazine. In February 1956, Dragon publications were adversely affected by a national general printing strike, which paralysed the industry and they ceased publishing novels altogether. After the printing strike was over, they successfully resumed printing operations but terminated their own activities as a publisher when Fearn, now engaged to be married, refused to renew his contract. A number of unpublished novels in their inventory, 2 westerns and 2 romances, all written by Fearn before his contract had expired in November 1955, were sold to another publisher, Brown Watson Limited, and eventually appeared in September 1956. Let's see on the spines there that these books were now published by Brown Watson Limited. Now, all of these detective novels that you see on the table here have been reprinted under Fearn's name in the UK by F.A. Thorpe and Loom Books, and by Wildside Press in the United States, and it can be found online. Several were first put into book form in Italian translations, you see there, and more particularly in this superb Canadian hardcover volume. See there, the cover is based on the Hugo Blaine novel, which is one of several of the novels we've been discussing that are reprinted in this Canadian omnibus hardcover. There's the full contents. includes the first ever publication of an unpublished Fearn novel, which I'll be discussing in later videos. And many people think that's the best novel he ever wrote. So we'll discuss that in a future video. Here we'll just see some of the covers which you'll recognise from the first part of this video. Excellent editions. There we see them again. Now this book is not available commercially for sale anywhere in the UK, but I have some spare copies, so if anyone was interested, they've just got to contact me. Now in future videos I'll be taking a look at even more of Fearn's many other remaining detective novels.